Whispers of History.
The year was 1879, deep in the rugged heart of Colorado's mountains, where the rush for gold had already claimed countless lives and dreams. It was a landscape as unforgiving as it was beautiful, jagged peaks piercing the sky, rivers running swift and icy, and mines carved into the earth like open wounds. Men traveled from across the nation, leaving behind their homes and families, drawn by the promise of fortune. Most would leave broken, their hopes shattered by the cold, the isolation, and the cruelty of chance. Yet among them was one miner whose fate would be etched not in wealth, but in disappearance. His name was Thomas Hale, a prospector who led a crew of 6 men into the wilderness, and from which none would ever return. The story is not merely about a miner lost in the wild, but about a vanishing so complete, so unexplained, that it became part of Colorado's folklore. The men were experienced, hardened by years of toil in camps that smelled of sweat, gunpowder, and whiskey. They had faced avalanches, sickness, and sudden violence in saloon disputes, yet nothing in their pasts suggested they would be swallowed whole by the mountains themselves. The last sighting of Hale and his crew was in the mining camp of Silver Plume, where they had stocked supplies, shared drinks with strangers, and set off toward a claim that was said to be rich in gold-bearing quartz. Days passed, then weeks. When no word came, other miners began to whisper. Search parties found only fragments: a broken lantern buried in snow, a mule wandering aimlessly with frostbitten ears, and boot prints that vanished abruptly near the tree line, as if the earth had simply opened and devoured them. The campfires they had built left behind nothing but blackened rings of ash, cold and lifeless. There were no bodies, no weapons, no notes carved into bark as last messages. It was as though the crew had been erased, their voices silenced without explanation. Some said they had been ambushed by outlaws, their remains hidden in caves. Others whispered of native spirits angered by the miners' intrusion into sacred ground. A few believed the mountains themselves had conspired against them, avalanches, rock slides, or sinkholes erasing all trace. But behind every theory lingered the same unease. Why was nothing ever found? In the saloons of Georgetown and Leadville, miners spoke of Hale in hushed tones, their faces shadowed by candlelight. They remembered him as a man of quiet determination, not reckless but steady, his voice low and certain when he spoke of gold. He had worked smaller claims before, scraping just enough to survive, but this time he believed fortune was finally within reach. His disappearance was not simply another tragedy. It was an omen, a reminder of how easily men could vanish into the folds of a land both vast and indifferent. By winter, the story had grown into legend. Newspapers published half-truths and speculation, painting the mountains as cursed. Mothers warned their sons against following in Hale's footsteps, while preachers used the tale as a sermon against greed. The disappearance unsettled not only those who knew him, but also the larger community, because it tapped into a primal fear, the fear of being lost beyond recovery, of leaving no trace, no closure for the living. And so, more than a century later, the mystery endures. What happened to Thomas Hale and his crew remains unsolved, suspended between history and myth. Perhaps they froze on the slopes and their bones lie hidden beneath layers of ice. Perhaps they were murdered and buried in shallow graves. Or perhaps, more chilling still, they simply stepped out of the world we know, swallowed by the silence of the mountains, leaving nothing behind but questions. The story of the gold miner who vanished with his crew is not just a tale of absence. It is a reminder of how the hunger for fortune collided with the wilderness, how men once gambled their lives against the unknown. Tonight we return to 1879, to the snowbound camps of Colorado, to the miners who disappeared without farewell. Their silence echoes still, a warning carried on the wind that sweeps through those cold peaks. And as we tell their story, we invite you to listen closely, not just to the history, but to the silence that follows. For sometimes, silence is the loudest voice of all. To understand the disappearance of Thomas Hale and his crew, we must first step back into the Colorado of the late 19th century, a place where hope, greed, and desperation collided daily. By 1879, the United States had transformed dramatically since the Civil War. Railroads stitched the country together, bringing settlers and goods deeper into territories once untouched. Yet while cities on the East Coast were beginning to embrace industry and electricity, the American West remained raw, dangerous. and ruled by forces beyond the control of law or order. Colorado, admitted as the 38th state just 3 years earlier in 1876, embodied this contradiction. Its mountains shimmered with promise, rich in veins of silver, lead, and most importantly, gold. Camps and towns like Leadville, Central City, and Silver Plume grew almost overnight, their streets lined with saloons, boarding houses, and mercantile shops. But prosperity was fragile. For every miner who struck it rich, hundreds more sank into debt, illness, or despair. Life in a mining camp was grueling. Men often lived in crude log cabins or canvas tents pitched against the wind. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Winters were harsh, with snow trapping camps for weeks at a time. Supplies had to be hauled up by mule or wagon, and food often consisted of beans, bacon, and hard bread. Whiskey was both medicine and escape. Accidents were common. Shafts collapsed, dynamite misfired, and cold rivers claimed their share of lives. Disease spread quickly in cramped quarters, where medical care was primitive at best. But despite the danger, men came in droves. Some were immigrants from Ireland, Germany, or Italy, seeking better futures than their homelands could offer. Others were Civil War veterans, hardened by battle but broken by peace, unable to adjust to civilian life. Still others were drifters, gamblers, or fugitives, looking for a chance to disappear into the mountains. What they all shared was a belief, sometimes rational, often delusional, that fortune lay waiting if only they could dig deep enough. The culture of mining was built on risk and rumor. Word of a rich strike could send hundreds rushing up a mountainside overnight. Many sold their meager belongings to buy picks, pans, or dynamite, driven by nothing more than hearsay. Campfire talk carried as much weight as formal surveys, and superstition blended with practical survival. Some miners swore by charms or rituals before blasting rock, while others refused to work on certain days, believing the mountain itself carried moods. The thin line between rational labor and mystical fear was part of everyday life. Colorado in 1879 was also a place of violent collision between cultures. Native American tribes such as the Ute had lived in these regions for centuries, their lives intertwined with the land. The arrival of miners and settlers brought destruction. Forests cleared, rivers polluted with tailings, sacred grounds desecrated. By the late 1870s, tensions had exploded into open conflict, most famously in the Meeker incident of that same year, where Ute warriors killed an Indian agent and his men after years of broken promises and encroachment. In such an environment, stories of cursed ground were not just superstition but reflections of deeper cultural wounds. Law and order in these camps were tenuous at best. Sheriffs were few, courts were distant, and vigilante justice was common. A man accused of theft or cheating at cards could be hanged before sunrise, his body left swinging as a warning. Disputes over mining claims often turned bloody, with pistols drawn in the mud outside saloons. In such places, the disappearance of 7 men, though alarming, was not entirely shocking, because death or vanishing was part of the landscape. But beyond the violence and greed lay something more haunting: isolation. The mountains of Colorado in the 1870s were vast and merciless. Trails twisted through forests so dense that daylight barely pierced the canopy. Snow could bury an entire camp overnight. Wolves howled in the distance, while avalanches could sweep away everything in moments. For men already living on the edge of survival, the thought of vanishing into such wilderness was not just possible, but frighteningly plausible. The psychology of these miners must also be considered. They lived lives of extremes, intense labor, crushing solitude, and bursts of reckless abandon in town. Mental strain was common. Some developed what was known as mountain fever, a mix of isolation, paranoia, and hallucination triggered by long winters. Others turned to violence or self-destruction. In this environment, a leader like Thomas Hale, guiding 6 men into the mountains, carried not only the burden of survival, but the weight of their fragile minds. At the same time, the press played a crucial role in shaping how stories like Hale's disappearance spread. Newspapers in Denver and beyond thrived on tales of mystery and violence, often embellishing details to sell copies. The West was marketed as a place of endless drama, a theater of outlaws, ghosts, and fortunes won or lost. The disappearance of a crew of miners was not simply reported as tragedy, but framed as legend, feeding the national appetite for stories of the wild frontier. And yet, Beneath the sensationalism lay a truth. The wilderness of Colorado in 1879 was not fully known, not fully mapped, and not entirely within the grasp of human control. Mines collapsed into the earth. Rivers shifted their course. Storms swept through without warning. A man could vanish into those mountains, and the land would not give him back. This was the stage upon which Thomas Hale and his crew entered, carrying picks, mules, and dreams of gold. Their story cannot be separated from this larger history. They were not the first to vanish, and they would not be the last. But their disappearance struck a deeper chord, because it came at a moment when Colorado was striving to prove itself as a stable new state, not a lawless frontier. The vanishing of 7 men into thin air challenged that image, suggesting that beneath the promise of progress still lay a wilderness that could not be tamed. Thus, the mystery of Hale and his crew is not only about 7 lives lost, it is about the fragile line between civilization and chaos, between fortune and ruin, between history and myth. The Colorado of 1879 was a place where these lines blurred daily, where men lived and died in pursuit of something shining just beyond their reach. To tell their story, we must hold in mind this larger world, a world of ambition and fear, of progress and peril, where disappearance was not just an accident, but a possibility woven into the very fabric of life. The journey began in the final weeks of autumn, when the days in Colorado grew short and the nights carried a biting chill that foreshadowed winter's approach. Thomas Hale, a man hardened by years in the mountains, gathered 6 companions for what he promised would be their most profitable expedition yet. They were men accustomed to risk, a pair of brothers from Missouri, a grizzled Civil War veteran, a younger immigrant who had drifted west after failing in the factories of Chicago, and 2 nameless drifters whose histories no one fully knew. Together they formed an uneasy brotherhood, bound not by friendship but by the promise of gold. They departed from Leadville with little fanfare, their mules laden with tools, flour, beans, salt pork, and the small comforts of whiskey and tobacco. Witnesses recalled their determination, though some remarked on Hale's increasingly secretive manner. He spoke of a hidden vein, far beyond the usual claims, a place he swore he had scouted before, though few believed him. Still, the promise of fortune was enough to pull men into the mountains, where danger was as constant as the wind. Their path led them through forests thick with spruce and pine, where the air grew heavy with silence and only the occasional crack of branches betrayed the presence of deer or something larger. On the 3rd night, as they camped by a creek, one of the brothers claimed to see figures moving in the tree line, pale shapes that disappeared when approached. The others laughed it off as whiskey-fueled nerves, but the unease lingered. They ate quickly that night, backs turned against the dark. The first true incident came on the 5th day, as they began their ascent into steeper ground. The young immigrant, eager to prove himself, wandered ahead with his pick slung over his shoulder. A scream echoed down the slope moments later. When the others reached him, they found him sprawled across jagged rocks, his leg twisted unnaturally. He insisted he had slipped, though his eyes darted nervously at the cliffs above, as if something had startled him. They bound his leg as best they could, but the delay weighed heavily on Hale's patience. Winter, he reminded them, was closing in. The crew pressed forward, slower now, but determined. At night, their campfires flickered against the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to move even when the men sat still. One evening, the veteran spoke of mountain voices, whispers carried on the wind that tempted weary men to wander into the dark. The drifters scoffed, yet none dared to leave the circle of light that night. Another loss came suddenly. One of the brothers, venturing to fetch water at dawn, did not return. His tracks led only a short distance before vanishing near the edge of a frozen pool. The surface was unbroken, the snow untouched, yet he was gone as though swallowed whole. The remaining men searched for hours, calling his name, firing shots into the air, but the forest gave no answer. That evening they sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the fire while an emptiness grew among them. Hale insisted they move on, his obsession with the hidden vein burning brighter even as his crew's numbers thinned. As they pushed deeper into the mountains, storms descended without warning. Snow fell thick and fast, erasing trails behind them, cutting off any hope of retreat. Hunger gnawed at their bellies as supplies dwindled. The injured immigrant grew feverish, his wound festering despite their efforts. He began muttering in broken English about shadows standing over him at night, watching, waiting. When his body was found cold the next morning, the others buried him shallowly beneath the snow, marking the spot with a crude wooden cross. The drifters grew restless, muttering that Hale had led them astray, that there was no gold, only death in these cursed hills. One night their voices rose into argument and one drew a knife. The veteran intervened, but tension remained sharp, ready to ignite. The next morning one of the drifters was missing, his bedroll abandoned. They searched but found only blood on the snow, smeared across rocks as though something had dragged him away. Hale ordered the others to keep moving, though doubt had crept into every face. Now only 4 remained: Hale, the surviving brother, the veteran, and the second drifter. Their campfires grew smaller, their rations stretched thin. At times they thought they saw lights flickering between the trees. Lanterns, perhaps, or the ghostly shimmer of something unearthly. The veteran swore he heard chanting carried on the wind, words he could not understand but that chilled him to the bone. The others dismissed it, yet each man took longer to fall asleep, lying awake to listen for the next unnatural sound. The final days blurred into a waking nightmare. The second drifter collapsed during the climb, his body too weak to carry on. They left him behind reluctantly, promising to return, though deep down each man knew they would not. When a storm swallowed the mountain in white, Hale and the 2 survivors huddled in a crude shelter, the wind howling like voices of the dead outside. By then, the surviving brother's mind had begun to unravel. He accused Hale of leading them to ruin, of trading their lives for a phantom vein of gold. His words became violent, spitting curses, until one night he vanished from the shelter altogether. Only a trail of footprints led into the blizzard, where they ended abruptly as if he had stepped off the edge of the world. Now only Hale and the veteran remained. The veteran, once strong and steady, grew weak from hunger. He clutched his chest one night and never woke again. Hale, alone in the storm, was left with only the echo of his own breath. What happened next remains unknown. Some believe Hale perished in those mountains, his body buried beneath snow and stone, his dream of gold lost forever. Others whisper that he found what he sought, that he struck a hidden vein and, unwilling to share, consigned his companions to death before vanishing himself. A few darker tales suggest he was claimed by the mountains themselves, drawn into some ancient force that swallowed men whole and left nothing but silence behind. When spring came and the snow melted, search parties combed the mountains. They found no camp, no tools, no graves. Only a few scraps of fabric tangled in the branches of a tree, and the faint impression of something heavy once dragged across the earth. Hale and his 6 men were never seen again. When word first reached the towns and mining camps that Thomas Hale and his crew had not returned, the reaction was cautious rather than alarmed. Men often vanished in the Rockies, swallowed by avalanches or broken by fever, and weeks could pass before they staggered back to civilization half-starved but alive. For a time, families waited with a weary patience, convincing themselves that delays were nothing unusual. But as winter gave way to spring and still no sign of the 7 men appeared, the whispers began. Wives paced the wooden floors of their homes in Leadville and Silver Cliff, clutching children who asked where their fathers had gone. The brother who had left behind a wife was spoken of in hushed tones at church gatherings. "The mountain takes what it wants," one old woman said, and others nodded solemnly, as if the earth itself demanded tribute. The first official response came from fellow miners, not the authorities. Colorado in 1879 was still a rough frontier where justice and investigation often began with the local community rather than formal law. Men who had known Hale, some admiring his stubbornness, others despising his arrogance, formed search parties. They set out into the same ridges where he was last seen, carrying rifles, shovels, and sacks of provisions. When they returned weeks later empty-handed, their faces pale and their voices tight, the unease deepened. They had found nothing, not even the remnants of a campfire. Doctors in the region speculated publicly in taverns and newspapers about what might have happened. One physician, who had treated frostbite cases during the previous winter, told the Rocky Mountain News that starvation and exposure were the likeliest culprits. "Men in such conditions begin to see visions," he explained, "and wander into the snow until their bodies yield." His clinical tone reassured some, but others found it inadequate. How could 7 men, seasoned by hardship, vanish without leaving so much as a pickaxe or mule carcass behind? Pastors, meanwhile, leaned into spiritual interpretation. At Sunday sermons across Colorado's mining towns, the missing crew became a warning against greed and hubris. "When man places gold above God, he invites ruin," one minister thundered, his congregation nodding with a mixture of fear and resignation. Stories of biblical punishment found fertile ground in communities already suspicious of Hale's restless obsession. For the faithful, his disappearance was less a mystery than divine judgment. Neighbors shared darker theories over hearths and in saloons. Some suggested that Hale had murdered his companions for a rich vein and then fled the territory. Others believed the men had turned on each other, driven mad by hunger and isolation. A handful whispered of cannibalism, recalling the horror of the Donner Party decades earlier. Though no evidence existed, the mere possibility of men eating men in those silent mountains chilled even the most hardened frontiersmen. Newspapers, always eager for sensational tales, seized upon the story. Headlines declared, "7 miners vanish in the Rockies," and "Gold fever leads to doom." Journalists embellished the accounts, describing ghost lights, phantom voices, and cursed canyons that devoured fortune seekers. Some articles strayed into outright fiction, imagining Hale still alive, hiding with a chest of gold, pursued by the restless spirits of his crew. While families wept and prayed, strangers thousands of miles away consumed their grief as entertainment. Psychological interpretation was limited in the 1870s, but a few intellectual voices tried to frame the incident within the growing field of mental science. Lecturers in Denver and St. Louis spoke of gold mania, an affliction where men's judgment collapsed under the weight of ambition. Hale, they argued, had been a victim of obsession, his mind consumed to the point of blindness. His men, trapped in his vision, paid the price. It was a rational explanation, yet it left the haunting absence unresolved. No bodies, no tools, no camp, only silence. For the local communities, that silence was the hardest part. Had they found bones, they might have mourned. Had they found wreckage, they could have built a story of tragedy. Instead, there was only emptiness, a hollow in the mountains that deepened with every retelling. Families who had lost sons and brothers lived with the unrelenting ache of uncertainty. Some wives remarried within a few years, needing stability for their children, though they carried quiet guilt, as if betraying the missing. Others clung to the hope that Hale or one of the men might yet stumble home. Over time, the mystery hardened into folklore. Children dared each other to walk the mountain trails where Hale was last seen, claiming they could hear ghostly picks striking rock. Old miners swore that if you camped too close to the high ridges, you would dream of voices urging you deeper into the dark. A prospector decades later claimed to have found a rusted shovel wedged between boulders, but when he returned with others, it had vanished. The incident also became a tool for shaping identity in a region still defining itself. For some, it was a cautionary tale about greed. For others, proof of the mountain's unyielding mystery. Local papers reprinted the story every few years, especially when new tragedies struck prospectors. Each retelling sharpened the legend, until Hale himself was no longer a man, but a symbol, the embodiment of ambition gone astray, swallowed by forces greater than human will. The broader American public, reading of the disappearance from afar, absorbed it as part of the mythology of the West. Just as the frontier birthed outlaws, lawmen and cowboys, it also produced tales of men who simply vanished into the wild. Hale and his crew joined that gallery of shadows, their story reinforcing the image of the Rockies not as a land of opportunity alone, but as a place where human ambition could dissolve without a trace. Even as years turned to decades, the mystery did not die. Descendants of the missing sometimes hired private investigators or wrote to newspapers, hoping for answers. Expeditions were launched sporadically, often by amateurs lured by both curiosity and treasure lust. None succeeded. Each return with empty hands only strengthened the belief that some secrets were not meant to be unearthed. And so, in the towns of Colorado, the story of Thomas Hale lingered like a ghost. Half history, half warning, and wholly unresolved. The summer after Hale and his men vanished, the mountain passes thawed enough for larger search parties to comb through the ridges where the miners were last seen. What began as a rescue mission quickly became something darker, a grim pilgrimage into a land that seemed determined to swallow all traces of those who entered. The first expedition, organized by miners from Leadville, carried supplies, lanterns, and even bloodhounds. They expected at the very least to stumble across a collapsed camp or scattered belongings. Instead, the mountains mocked them with silence. The dogs refused to track, whining and pulling away from certain gullies as if repelled by something invisible. Men muttered prayers under their breath, unwilling to admit how the endless quiet unnerved them. After several fruitless days, they stumbled upon a clearing high on the ridge. There, under a tangle of pines, they found what might have been the remnants of a campfire. The stones were blackened, but the arrangement was strange, a perfect circle, meticulously laid, as though part of a ritual rather than a place to boil coffee. Nearby, they discovered bones, small, brittle, and scorched. At first, the men thought them to be animal remains, perhaps a deer or goat. But one man, who had studied medicine before turning to mining, insisted that at least one fragment looked human. The others quickly buried the evidence, swearing each other to silence. Back in town, they claimed to have found nothing. That decision to conceal what they had seen only deepened the mystery. Rumors spread that the crew had turned to cannibalism, devouring one another in the snow. Others whispered of something worse, that Hale himself had led them in strange rites, sacrifices to the mountain in exchange for gold. The image of a ring of stones, glowing with embers in the wilderness, entered local folklore like a shadow that would not fade. A second expedition followed weeks later, this one organized not by miners but by desperate families. Wives, brothers, and cousins hired trackers and trappers to guide them into the high country. These searchers were not hardened by the superstition of the camps. They clung to hope, however faint, that their loved ones might yet be found alive. Their journey was cruel. Storms lashed the peaks without warning, and at night the wind carried sounds that many swore were voices. A woman, sister to one of the missing, claimed she heard her brother calling her name through the trees. The guides dismissed it as grief and exhaustion, but her cries unsettled the others, planting dread where determination had been. On the third day, they came upon a narrow ravine littered with shattered rock. There, pressed into the dirt as if by some terrible weight, they found what looked like the impression of a boot. Only one, half-worn, pointing toward the sheer wall of stone. No trail of footprints led in or out. The families returned home hollow-eyed, clutching that single image as proof of both presence and impossibility. The press feasted on such details. Articles grew more grotesque with each retelling. Fires that burned without fuel, screams carried on the wind, skeletal figures glimpsed at dusk. Some journalists claimed Hale's crew had uncovered a vein of cursed gold, and that in their greed they had been dragged beneath the earth. Others suggested the men had joined a hidden sect of mountain hermits, abandoning civilization for rituals older than the land itself. Yet amid all the sensationalism, the most haunting testimony came not from reporters, but from the searchers themselves. Men spoke of nights when they awoke certain that someone, or something, stood just beyond the firelight. They described the uncanny sensation of being watched, though no eyes glimmered in the dark. One miner confessed that, while alone gathering wood, he felt a hand brush his shoulder. He spun, torch raised, and saw nothing but empty trees. He left the expedition the next morning, refusing to go back. By autumn, the search had ceased. The snow returned, sealing the high country in white silence once again. Families grieved in the only way they could, by holding services without bodies, placing empty coffins in the ground. Yet even in mourning, there lingered the uneasy knowledge that no grave truly contained the men they loved. The mountain had claimed them whole. It was during one such service that a final, chilling twist entered the tale. A miner who had once worked under Hale arrived uninvited at the gathering. He was gaunt, fever-eyed, muttering half-coherent phrases about the fire ring and the voice beneath the stone. Before anyone could stop him, he declared that Hale had not died at all, that he had walked willingly into the mountain, and that the others had followed. "He found the vein," the man whispered hoarsely. "He found it, and the mountain took its due." He was escorted out before he could say more, but his words hung like smoke. The claim was, of course, impossible to prove. But in the months and years that followed, others began to report odd encounters in the high Rockies. A prospector claimed he saw 7 figures standing in a line on a ridge at dusk, their silhouettes rigid and unmoving. A hunter spoke of hearing picks striking rock deep underground. though he was miles from any known shaft. A traveling preacher swore he saw a man's face flicker in the firelight during his prayers, gaunt, hollow-cheeked, with eyes like burning coals. Each account only tightened the grip of fear. Even hardened frontiersmen began to avoid the ridge where Hale had last camped, calling it the Hollow Range. Newcomers were warned not to linger there, and those who ignored the advice often returned shaken, pale, speaking little of what they'd experienced. What made the story so powerful was not simply the disappearance itself, but the lack of resolution. People can endure tragedy. What they cannot endure is mystery without closure. And in that absence, imagination filled the void with horrors more enduring than any grave. For the people of Colorado in 1879, the climax of the tale was not a single moment of discovery, but rather the slow, crushing realization that there would be no discovery at all. No bodies, no answers, only silence, and the growing suspicion that the mountain itself had swallowed Hale and his crew, not merely as a place of death, but as a kind of living force, a thing that could absorb men whole and leave nothing behind but fear. It was this silence that birthed the legend. Hale's name, once spoken with either admiration or contempt, became something more spectral. Children were warned not to wander too far lest the gold miner take you. Miners crossing the ridge spat on the ground, muttering to keep spirits at bay. And in the long nights of winter, when the wind howled across the peaks, some swore they heard the ring of hammers echoing faintly in the stone, as though the vanished crew still toiled beneath the mountain, digging forever in the dark. That was the climax of the story, the transformation of men into myth, of tragedy into terror. A disappearance that should have ended in grief instead spiraled into something far stranger, a haunting that belonged not to any single family, but to an entire land. Years slipped into decades, and yet the story of Hale and his crew never faded. In fact, absence only sharpened the legend. Each generation retold the tale, and with every telling the line between fact and folklore blurred until they were one and the same. For the families who lost husbands, brothers and sons, the absence was a wound that never fully closed. Graves were filled with stones, names carved into wood and later marble, but the knowledge that the men's bodies were never found left a raw uncertainty. Widows raised children on whispered promises that perhaps, just perhaps, the men were still alive, living in some hidden valley. The children grew up haunted, always glancing toward the mountains as though they might one day return, yet the mountains gave nothing back. Historians have debated what truly happened. Some argue the crew likely succumbed to exposure, their bodies buried by snow and rock slides before they could be found. The Rockies are unforgiving. Avalanches have entombed entire groups within minutes, leaving not a trace for centuries. It is a rational explanation, grounded in geology and weather. But the problem is not logic, it is silence. The silence of 7 men vanishing at once, leaving behind no tools, no animals, not even the scattered remnants of panic. Disappearances usually leave fragments. Hale's crew left none. Folklorists see in this tale the echo of older stories. The land around the Rockies has long been steeped in native traditions, many of which speak of mountains as living beings, keepers of both treasure and vengeance. Some elders told of places where the earth opened and swallowed those who trespassed too greedily. For them, Hale's disappearance was not mystery, but inevitability, a continuation of warnings that outsiders had ignored for generations. Psychologists, looking back with modern eyes, interpret the hysteria differently. The era of the gold rush was fueled by extremes: extreme greed, extreme risk, extreme isolation. In such pressure, paranoia thrives. Men working in remote camps often experienced auditory hallucinations, hearing voices in the howling wind. Hunger and altitude sickness could drive delusion. Perhaps the families and searchers projected their fear into the wilderness, weaving horror out of grief. Perhaps the mountains themselves did nothing at all. And yet, when one stands among the Rockies, it is hard not to feel that weight. The sheer cliffs rise like walls cutting off sound. Shadows stretch long and deep, swallowing whole valleys even in daylight. The idea that men could vanish here is not far-fetched. What unsettles is not that they vanished, but how completely. As years turned to centuries, the tale mutated. In mining towns, old men swore Hale had struck gold too rich, too perfect, or that could not have come from this earth. He and his men were cursed for touching it, dragged into the stone by the spirits who guarded it. Others claim to see lights flickering on the ridges at night, lanterns bobbing where no man should be. Hunters reported voices carried by the wind, sometimes shouting, sometimes weeping. A few dared to say they saw figures, 7 of them, always 7, standing in the tree line, motionless, watching. Skeptics dismiss such stories as superstition, but even they admit one detail remains unnerving. In more than a century since, no trace of Hale or his men has ever been discovered. The mountain has yielded bones of mammoth and mastodon, skeletons of pioneer wagons lost to blizzards, even relics of Spanish expeditions centuries older. But not Hale, not his crew, not a single button or buckle. The epilogue of their story, then, is not resolution, but haunting. A haunting that belongs not to a ghost, but to a landscape, a reminder of the razor-thin line between ambition and oblivion. The story warns of greed, yes, but also of the hubris of believing we can tame land older and larger than ourselves. Some nights, when storms gather and the peaks glow with lightning, locals say you can hear the strikes of pickaxes echoing through the mountains, faint, rhythmic, like men still laboring underground. Whether it is imagination, the shifting of stone, or something far stranger, no one can say. What endures is not the gold Hale sought, nor the lives he and his men lived, but the silence they left behind. That silence has become their monument, deeper than graves, heavier than stone, and so their story closes not with an answer, but with a question. What waits in the heart of the mountain? Patient and silent, watching as men come with hunger in their eyes. Was it chance or curse, or something we cannot name that took Hale and his crew into the dark? Perhaps the mountain still keeps them. Perhaps they are still digging, shadows in the stone, forever chasing the vein of gold that first lured them upward. Or perhaps they were never meant to be found at all.